What if the very blood that crowned kings and queens was also the poison that destroyed them? Across centuries, Europe's most powerful thrones were not toppled by swords or rebellions, but by something far quieter, far deadlier, an invisible curse running through the veins of their rulers. This was no ordinary fate. It was the direct result of choices made inside gilded palaces, where marriage was not about love but about keeping power locked tightly inside the family. Before we start our video, I heard that all of you are listening to the stories from all around the world. Comment below where you're listening from and what do you find interesting in the story. If you enjoy the video, just tap the like button. Subscribe to our channel for more upcoming stories like this. Okay, let's get back to our story. Royal blood was treated as sacred, untouchable, superior to all others. And yet, in their desperate attempts to preserve this purity, monarchs created a legacy of fragility, madness, and genetic collapse. The story of royal inbreeding is not a footnote in history. It is the spine of entire dynasties. Look closely, and you will see how family trees stopped branching outward and instead coiled inward, closing upon themselves like a snake devouring its own tail. Cousins became husbands, nieces became wives, uncles became fathers, and the results were often horrific. Children born to these unions carried not the strength of empires, but the shadow of disease, the mark of deformity, the curse of minds slipping into chaos. Behind the polished portraits and glittering crowns, there were frail bodies, trembling hands, and whispers of madness that courtiers dared not speak aloud. One dynasty in particular became the living symbol of this tragedy, the Habsburgs. Their empire stretched across Europe, their armies conquered nations, their wealth glittered beyond measure, but their most infamous legacy was not military or political. It was the jaw. The so-called Habsburg jaw was more than a grotesque feature etched onto their faces. It was the visible evidence of generations of incest. And yet, even as their portraits betrayed the truth, these rulers doubled down, marrying closer and closer relatives, convinced that mingling with outsiders would dilute their divine right to rule. But the Habsburgs were not alone. From the Spanish court to the Russian palaces, from Vienna to London, monarchs sacrificed the health of their heirs for dynastic pride. Hemophilia bled through the veins of princes. Madness stalked kings who raved to shadows. Queens endured miscarriage after miscarriage, their bodies too weak to carry the burden of inbred children. These were not isolated tragedies but recurring patterns, echoing across centuries like a curse. Tonight, we step into that shadow. Over the next chapters, we will uncover the most infamous cases of royal inbreeding, each one a story not just of power and politics, but of human suffering sealed behind palace doors. Some monarchs limped through life under the weight of deformities. Others lost entire dynasties to genetic collapse. And yet, all of them believed they were preserving something holy. What they actually preserved was death. And by the time the world realized it, it was already too late. If there is one figure who embodies the nightmare of royal inbreeding, it is Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, he was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, and he was less a king than a living monument to the dynasty's obsession with blood purity. From the moment he came into the world, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. His body was frail, his mind clouded, his very appearance a grotesque reminder of centuries of incestuous unions. The Habsburg jaw that had haunted his ancestors reached its peak in him so pronounced that he could barely chew his food. His tongue was oversized, his speech slurred, and he struggled even to swallow. He was, in every sense, the product of a family tree that had folded in upon itself for generations. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents? Cousins. His great-grandparents? Closer still. Over and over, the Habsburgs chose to keep power in the bloodline. And by the time Charles was born, that bloodline was poisoned beyond repair. Physicians recorded that the boy did not walk until the age of 8, did not speak until 4, and never truly matured into a man who could rule. He was plagued with epileptic fits, chronic illness, and a mind so clouded that his courtiers whispered he was more child than king. In the dark corners of the palace, some called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, convinced he was cursed by demons. In truth, the curse was his own family's making. But Spain could not simply abandon him. He was, after all, the king. And so the empire dressed him in silks, placed a crown upon his head, and pretended he could command. Behind the ceremony, however, Spain's enemies circled like wolves. The once mighty empire rotted under the weight of a monarch, too weak to produce an heir, too sickly to lead, and too broken to inspire loyalty. His marriages, arranged of course to secure alliances, were humiliating failures. Despite wedding twice, he fathered no children, his body incapable of continuing the dynasty. Courtiers and clergy prayed. Doctors performed bizarre rituals, but nothing could reverse centuries of damage written in his very DNA. By the time Charles died in 1700, at just 38 years old, his body was so ravaged that the autopsy became a legend of horror. His heart was said to be the size of a grain of pepper, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten, and his body filled with water. His head, however, was grotesquely large, his jaw monstrously deformed. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with him, not because of conquest or rebellion, but because the family had effectively destroyed itself from within. The crown passed to a different branch of the family, but the lesson remained. Dynastic pride had not preserved their legacy, it had annihilated it. Charles II was no ordinary king. He was the ghost of a dynasty, collapsing under its own arrogance. A tragic reminder that even the mightiest empires can fall, not with a bang, but with the slow suffocation of their own bloodline. If Spain's tragedy was written on the face of Charles II, Russia's curse flowed silently through its veins. In the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg, the Romanovs appeared untouchable czars and czarinas draped in jewels, presiding over a vast empire that stretched from Europe to the edge of Asia. Yet beneath the golden chandeliers and the icy pageantry of court life, their dynasty carried a hidden flaw that would one day help bring an empire to its knees. Hemophilia, the royal disease. It was a silent killer, born not from poor governance or rebellion, but from bloodlines twisted too tightly together, generation after generation. The story begins with Queen Victoria of Britain, whose own family tree spread across Europe like roots of a poisoned tree. Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia, though she never suffered its effects herself. Instead, she passed the disease like a hidden curse into the houses of Spain, Germany, and, most fatefully, into Russia through her granddaughter, Alexandra Feodorovna, the last empress of the Romanovs. When she married Nicholas II, she carried more than jewels and noble titles into Russia. She carried the fatal flaw that would doom her only son, the Crown Prince Alexei. Alexei was born in 1904, and from his first years it became clear that his blood was as fragile as glass. Hemophilia meant that a single bruise, a small fall, or even the slightest cut could cause unstoppable bleeding. His joints swelled with agony, his body weakened, and his parents watched in terror as their heir's life dangled by a thread. Doctors were powerless. Modern medicine could not stop the bleeding. The Romanovs, desperate, turned not to science but to mysticism. And it was here that one of history's darkest figures stepped into the story. Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin, the so-called mad monk, promised healing when no doctor could deliver. His strange presence, his hypnotic gaze, and his inexplicable ability to calm the boy's suffering made Alexandra believe he was sent by God. To her, Rasputin was not just a holy man, he was the savior of the dynasty. But to others, his influence was poison. Whispers spread through the court that the empire was being ruled not by Nicholas, nor even by Alexandra, but by a mystic peasant with unwashed hands and eyes of fire. In the salons of St. Petersburg, nobles scoffed, soldiers grumbled, and the people raged as their empire slipped toward revolution. The Romanovs clung to Rasputin because they could not face the truth. The curse of their bloodline had crippled their future. Every time Alexei fell ill, panic swept the palace. Every time he recovered, Rasputin's power grew. It was a vicious cycle born not of politics, but of a single genetic flaw carried through centuries of incestuous unions and dynastic pride. And as Russia descended into unrest, famine, and war, the image of a sickly boy and his desperate mother became a symbol of the empire's fragility. In the end, the Romanovs fell not only because of revolutionaries with rifles, but because their bloodline carried a secret too fragile to withstand the weight of an empire. Alexei never grew to rule. His hemophilia ensured he could never lead armies into battle, never secure his family's power. The dynasty collapsed in gunfire in a Siberian cellar in 1918. But in truth, the seeds of their downfall had been planted decades earlier in the blood passed down by their queen, the blood that carried death instead of life. Across the English Channel, another royal bloodline began to unravel, not with physical deformity or fragile veins, but with a mind that slipped further and further from reality. King George III of Britain, once hailed as a capable ruler, became a living symbol of how dynastic pride could turn into dynastic curse. His reign began with promise in 1760, when he ascended the throne at just 22 years old, a vigorous young monarch determined to strengthen his kingdom. Yet beneath the royal regalia, his body carried a hidden flaw, one that would haunt him for decades. A mysterious illness, striking him down in waves, warping his mind, and leaving history to remember him as the Mad King. For years, George governed with diligence, but slowly, symptoms emerged that confounded his physicians. His skin flushed a strange purple, his eyes darted wildly, and his speech spilled into uncontrollable torrents. At times, he would talk for hours without pause, leaping from one subject to another, his thoughts tangled and incoherent. Servants recorded him babbling until he foamed at the mouth or pacing the halls in manic fits, his sanity slipping further away with each passing episode. The illness came and went in cycles, moments of lucidity followed by storms of madness that terrified his court. Modern historians believe he may have suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that turns the body's blood toxic and attacks the mind. Whether inherited through the interwoven Hanoverian bloodline or triggered by centuries of dynastic breeding, the effect was the same: a king descending into chaos. His madness was more than a personal tragedy, it was a national crisis. Britain was not a minor kingdom, it was an empire stretching across oceans. When George's mind faltered, so did the state. At the height of his illness, Britain lost the American colonies, a humiliation that echoed across Europe. While history books often debate whether his madness directly caused the empire's loss, the symbolism was undeniable. An empire's strength tied to the failing health of one man, whose body and mind bore the cost of a cursed inheritance. Parliament was forced to act, with his son ruling as regent while courtiers whispered behind velvet curtains about whether the king should be deposed. What made George's condition more haunting was how human he became in his torment. He was not a monster, nor a tyrant in the traditional sense. He was a man trapped within his own skull, a prisoner of his poisoned blood. In rare moments of clarity, he wept openly, apologizing for his failures, speaking tenderly of his family. But as quickly as lucidity came, madness returned, dragging him into raving hallucinations that left him shrieking through the night. The courtiers could dress him in robes and surround him with ceremony, but they could not restore his mind. By the end of his life, he was blind, deaf, and completely insane. His kingdom effectively ruled by others, while he wasted away, alone inside a palace of shadows. To Britain's enemies, George's madness was a sign of weakness. To his subjects, it was a national shame. Yet to history, it remains another reminder of how the pride of royal bloodlines often carried within it a terrible price. Power concentrated in families may have built kingdoms, but in those same veins ran the seeds of collapse, whether in twisted jaws, fragile blood, or poisoned mind. In the story of George III, the empire's strength and fragility were one and the same, bound in the body of a king who became a ghost long before he died. Long before Europe's monarchs cursed their heirs with fragile bodies and poisoned minds, another dynasty on the banks of the Nile had already proven what happens when royal bloodlines turn inward. The Ptolemies, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. But unlike their pharaoh predecessors, who often drew new blood into the royal line through alliances, the Ptolemies sealed themselves off. Brothers married sisters, uncles wed nieces, and cousins intertwined endlessly, not out of love, but out of an obsession with purity. To the Ptolemies, the throne of Egypt was so sacred that only those of their blood could share it, even if that meant sharing it with their own kin. What began as a strategy for unity became a slow unraveling, where loyalty collapsed into betrayal, and the family tree became less a tree and more a closed circle, choking itself to death. Cleopatra VII, the dynasty's most famous and final queen, was the last bloom of this poison garden. She has been immortalized as a seductress, a cunning strategist, the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But behind her legend was a lineage already cracking under the weight of centuries of incest. Cleopatra herself was the product of sibling unions, though ancient records blur the exact details of which brother or cousin fathered which child in the tangled dynasty. What is clear is that her family's obsession with keeping power in the blood produced generations plagued by madness, cruelty, and paranoia. The Ptolemaic court became a theater of betrayal. Siblings not only married each other, they murdered one another. It was common for a queen to poison her brother husband, or for a king to strangle a sister wife to secure the throne. Power shifted in waves of bloodshed until the dynasty resembled less a family than a snake pit. Ptolemy VIII, called Fiscon, meaning the pot-bellied, slaughtered his own kin to maintain control. He even dismembered his son and sent the pieces to his wife, who was also his sister, in an act of cruelty so grotesque it seared itself into the annals of history. These were not the noble unions that the Ptolemies claimed. They were the violent consequences of a dynasty folding in upon itself. By the time Cleopatra ascended to power, Egypt was already weakened. Its rulers were less Egyptian than Greek, its dynasty alienated from its people, and its once mighty throne corrupted by generations of self-devouring ambition. Cleopatra was intelligent, multilingual, politically brilliant, but even she could not escape the shadow of her bloodline. She too married her own brothers, first Ptolemy XIII, then Ptolemy XIV. Both unions as much ritual as strategy. These marriages, like those before them, ended in betrayal and bloodshed. Cleopatra outlived both husbands, but the curse of her family remained. She inherited a throne built on incest, a dynasty rotting from within, even as Rome's shadow stretched across the Mediterranean. When the Roman legions marched into Egypt, the Ptolemies could no longer hold their empire together. Cleopatra fought desperately, allying herself with Rome's most powerful men, but the centuries-old curse of her bloodline had already done its work. The dynasty collapsed with her death in 30 BCE, and Egypt became just another province under the Roman eagle. The Ptolemies had preserved their pure royal blood, but in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. Their incestuous unions had not strengthened the dynasty, they had shattered it, leaving only Cleopatra's tragic legend to echo across time. If ever there was a dynasty that bore its curse on its very skin, it was the Habsburgs. For centuries, they dominated Europe, ruling Austria, Spain, Hungary, and vast swathes of the Holy Roman Empire. They were the architects of alliances, the masters of royal marriages, binding nations not through war but through vows whispered in gilded chapels. Their motto was simple: "Let others wage wars, you happy Austria, marry." But hidden in that strategy was a fatal flaw. They married not far and wide, but close and closer still, weaving their lineage into knots too tangled to undo. Cousin wed cousin, uncle wed niece, and generation after generation, the dynasty bred itself into a corner. The result became so notorious, it was given a name: the Habsburg jaw. The Habsburg chin jutted forward, grotesquely elongated, the lower lip swollen and pendulous, the teeth misaligned so badly some could not chew solid food. Portraits of Habsburg monarchs reveal a progression of deformity, as though each brushstroke over centuries captured the dynasty, slowly collapsing into caricature. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, was one of the most famous sufferers, his jaw so distorted that he spoke with difficulty and drooled uncontrollably. His great-grandson, Charles II of Spain, whom we have already met in this tale, was the ultimate culmination: sterile, deformed, mentally broken, the last and most tragic fruit of this poison tree. But the Habsburg curse was not merely physical. With their twisted features came fragile bodies, stunted growth, infertility, and minds riddled with madness. Doctors of the time could not understand it, and courtiers whispered of divine punishment, a sign that God himself had turned against the dynasty. Behind the gold and jewels of their palaces lurked an unspoken horror: the realization that their greatest strength, the unity of their blood, was also their undoing. The very strategy that had made them the most powerful family in Europe had also ensured their decline. The deformities became both symbol and prophecy. Artists, bound by duty, painted them with reverence, but no brush could conceal the jutting jaws or the slack expressions. The people of Europe began to see their rulers as grotesque figures, reminders that even emperors could not escape the judgment of nature. Whispers turned to ridicule, and ridicule turned to fear. If the rulers themselves were visibly broken, how strong could their empire truly be? By the 17th century, the Habsburg dominion was vast, but its bloodline was crumbling. Wars sapped their resources, rebellions flared, and one by one, their heirs failed to secure lasting legacies. When Charles II of Spain died childless in 1699, the Spanish branch of the family collapsed entirely, plunging Europe into the War of Spanish Succession. The empire fractured, its power redistributed, its once mighty dynasty remembered not for its glories, but for its deformities. The Habsburg jaw became more than a medical oddity, it became a metaphor. Power had been concentrated so tightly within their own veins that it poisoned itself. Their twisted faces were not accidents of nature, but the inevitable mark of centuries of choices, a living reminder that dynastic pride carries a price. When the Habsburgs looked into their own mirrors, they did not merely see emperors or kings. They saw the curse of their own making, etched bone deep, grinning back at them from their own reflection. While the Habsburgs wore their curse upon their jaws, the Bourbons of France carried theirs in the illusion of invincibility. For centuries they reigned with divine right, their palaces glittering, their courts overflowing with wealth and ceremony. To the common people, they were near gods, distant beings draped in silk and crowned in gold. But like all dynasties, the Bourbons could not resist the temptation of binding their bloodlines too tightly. Cousins intermarried across Europe, alliances formed not with fresh vitality but with familiar names, and behind the radiant mask of Versailles lay a house quietly rotting from the inside. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, seemed to defy that fate. His reign dazzled Europe with unmatched grandeur. Yet even as he stood radiant, his blood carried the shadow of countless unions too close for comfort. His descendants, weakened by the same practices that had plagued the Habsburgs and Ptolemies, inherited not his brilliance but his fragility. Infertility, stillbirths, and sickly heirs haunted the Bourbon nursery. The royal line began to thin, each branch carrying fewer leaves until the dynasty's survival itself grew precarious. By the 18th century, the Bourbons were trapped in the same suffocating cycle, marrying relatives, producing fragile heirs, and clinging to traditions that no longer matched the tides of a changing world. Louis XVI, the monarch who would face the revolution, embodied this decline. He was not grotesque like Charles II of Spain, nor flamboyantly cruel like Ivan the Terrible, but he was weak, indecisive, and paralyzed by the weight of his lineage. His marriage to Marie Antoinette, herself a Habsburg princess, was intended to strengthen the bond between two great houses, but it only deepened the curse. Their bloodlines, both already strained by centuries of intermarriage, mingled without relief. Their children suffered from frailty and ill health, and rumors of deformity and infertility spread through the streets of Paris like wildfire. To a starving people, the sight of gilded carriages carrying pale, delicate royals was not a display of majesty, but a sign of rot. The Bourbons, like their inbred cousins across Europe, had become detached from reality. Their palaces were filled with ritual and etiquette, while outside their gates, hunger and anger festered. The revolution was not merely the people rising against taxes or tyranny. It was the final act of a bloodline too blinded by its own reflection to see the storm on the horizon. When the guillotine fell on Louis XVI in 1793, it was not only the execution of a king, it was the execution of a dynasty that had ignored the warning carved into the bones of the Habsburgs, the whispers that haunted the Ptolemies, the madness that destroyed the Romanovs. The curse of the Bourbons was not madness or deformity, but arrogance and unshakable belief that divine blood could never fail them. But divine blood is still human blood, and when diluted too narrowly, it weakens, it falters, it fails. The guillotine's blade was sharp, but it was history itself that delivered the fatal blow. The once mighty house of Bourbon crumbled not just under the weight of revolution, but under the centuries of choices that had bound its future to a fragile, poisoned lineage. Across the centuries, from the tombs of Egypt to the palaces of Versailles, one truth emerges with frightening clarity. The more tightly power is gripped, the more fragile it becomes. The Ptolemies sought to preserve divinity by marrying within their own blood, only to find themselves plagued by madness and betrayal. The Habsburgs wove their empire together through endless cousin marriages, but carved the evidence of their choices into their very skulls, their protruding jaws mocking their grandeur. The Romanovs, the Bourbons, the Tudors all believed they were safeguarding their legacies. Yet in doing so, they planted the seeds of their own destruction. What these rulers could not understand was that no crown, no empire, no supposed divine right could protect them from nature's silent judgment. The curse of royal bloodlines was not an otherworldly malediction, but a human one. It was born of pride, of desperation, of fear. The fear of losing power led them to circle tighter and tighter, closing the gates of marriage and binding their children to cousins, uncles, even siblings. Generation after generation, the blood grew weaker, the heirs sicker, the minds more fragile. Their bodies became battlegrounds where the invisible scars of their ambition played out deformities, infertility, stillbirths, and insanity, all whispered reminders that power taken at too high a cost can never last. Each royal family thought themselves eternal, yet one by one, their lineages shattered, their palaces crumbled, and their names became cautionary tales etched into history's shadows. But the most haunting lesson is not how these dynasties fell, it is how blind they were to their own decline. Courtiers covered deformities with silk and jewels. Physicians whispered half-truths to terrified queens, and priests reassured kings that their blood was sacred. Yet behind every gilded door, the truth festered. History remembers their crowns, their wars, their palaces, but it also remembers the jaws that jutted too far, the minds that wandered into madness, the kings who could not produce heirs, and the queens who watched their children die one by one. Power made them untouchable in life, but in death it made them symbols of hubris, monuments to the dangers of trying to outwit nature itself. And so the curse lingers not as a myth, but as a warning. The higher the tower, the greater the fall. The tighter the blood is bound, the quicker it withers. Dynasties, no matter how divine they believed themselves to be, were still bound to the same laws as the peasants who tilled their fields. Inbreeding, secrecy, and pride did not elevate them above humanity. It dragged them below it. The Habsburg jaw, the Romanov madness, the Bourbon arrogance, each is a fragment of the same haunting story. When we walk today through the ruins of their palaces or gaze upon their portraits in museums, we are not simply looking at history, we are staring into warnings carved by bone, written in blood, and sealed by fate. The curse of royal bloodlines was never about gods or devils. It was about the dangers of power and the price it demands when men and women believe themselves immortal. The crown, it seems, does not sit easily on a head that carries the weight of its own poisoned blood.